how the people are doing. So, the X200 Pro, I gotta say, it is, despite its faults, quite a fantastic and a really well-rounded camera system that we have. Now the X200 Ultra, naturally, it is a better camera system. It has to be, it's the Ultra as opposed to the Pro. But there are quite a few changes that have been made. As you might know, the 35mm shift that we've had with the main camera, that's an obvious one. But there are quite a few other things as well that we'll be delving into, like the high-res situation, the 9-point situation, all of that has changed. And it has changed, in my opinion at least, for the better. Now, we'll see exactly if those things are actually going to be particularly effective and particularly something that might sway some people to actually go through the extra hassle of buying the Chinese version of the X200 Ultra, because that's the only thing available, sadly, and also importing it from China, all that hassle involved. Well, let's see if the cameras are worth it. Now, as per usual, we are starting off with our color profiles. Of course, if you have seen any of the previous comparisons with either of these two phones, you already know exactly what we're dealing with here. We have the vivid colors, which is, as the name indicates, it's going to be vibrant. And then we have Zeiss natural colors, which is exactly the way that I would recommend you to use it, because it's just going to give you the most well-rounded, most consistent, most natural colors. And honestly, I think it is one of the most natural color profiles that we have, bar none. And lastly, we have texture mode, which is more for a stylized look, especially if you have flat lighting. Then texture mode is going to give you just an insane amount of contrast, and that happens on both. But of course, I would say that the consistency on the texture mode is what's holding it back, and it's why I don't recommend using it on a regular basis. However, let us talk about that 35mm situation. So here's the deal. I'm kind of split about that, because the way I've used it, the way I've seen it being used is that, yes, on one hand, you have the advantages. You don't get any distortion. It gives you a very nice, tight, compressed shot, which is very professional, and honestly, I can see the appeal. I can see why 35mm is such a nice, sweet spot of a focal length. But then again, that can cause problems, like I faced in the previous comparison against the Xiaomi 15 Ultra. What happened was I was taking a lot of these photos in one of my art exhibitions, and a lot of those photos kind of required me to step back quite a lot with the X200 Ultra because we have this 35mm mode. A lot of the corridors were kind of narrow, so we didn't really have enough space to back off. I had to resort to using the ultrawide camera and then crop in a little bit because I wanted it to be at least a little bit tighter than the 14mm ultrawide that we have on the X200 Ultra. So I'm sure you can understand why this could be a problem, right? Of course, it really depends on your use cases. If you're just taking regular sprawling landscapes, then maybe you don't care about that. If you're taking basic architecture photos like I am in this very comparison, it did not affect me in the slightest, if anything at all. I really like the fact that all the lines are straight, we don't have any distortion whatsoever, and the overall tighter composition can actually be quite nice. But that did make me curious. What if you wanted a similar 35mm focal length on the X200 Pro? You can just double tap on the 1x toggle on your X200 Pro's camera app and it'll be good to go. But does it give you the similar level of detail? If anything at all, I can tell you the colors are very different, and it's a little bit off on the X200 Pro. The exposure is really low, especially in the midtones and the shadows. It's crushing things quite a lot, which is unfortunate. While the X200 Ultra, as you would expect from the Ultra device, it's actually giving you perfect colors. And cropping all the way in, it is very obvious that 35mm difference, even though it seems like it's such a small difference, it's just a 1.5x crop as opposed to 1x on the X200 Pro, the difference is significant, and the details are definitely much higher on the X200 Ultra. So with the main camera at least, barring the focal length difference, which is the obvious difference between the two, I would say that you will get marginally better results, marginally more consistent results, especially when you're using Zeiss natural colors and you want the proper natural color tones. Now, when it comes to the ultrawide camera, things are a lot more interesting. I know, it might surprise you because you might have thought, well, the huge difference in the main camera focal lengths and all that jazz that was happening, that's already quite a big thing, but the ultrawide camera, it gets a whole lot more crazy. Because, first and foremost, we have a much wider field of view, which is a very welcome change. I think the X200 Pro's ultrawide is the least ultrawide that we have. On the other hand, secondly, and very importantly, we have a fairly significant sensor upgrade because the X200 Ultra is using the exact same sensor as its main camera on the ultrawide as well. So basically what we have is that we have the same hardware across the main and the ultrawide camera. That does give you a lot of good consistency because on the X200 Pro, you'll notice that a lot of the warm tones are not exactly accurate. The X200 Ultra is the one that's depicting them perfectly. There's almost no difference between the X200 Ultra's main camera, its ultrawide camera, and also reality, because we did have these orangish tones as opposed to the much more yellow tones that we're getting on the X200 Pro's ultrawide output specifically. Now, I would not say that the X200 Ultra's ultrawide camera gives you the exact same level of photography quality, like the output detail level is not as high as the main camera. That could be processing related, it could be related to the optics, anything of that sort, but without a doubt, I can tell you it is one of the highest quality ultrawides that I've used. Because with this 500% crop right here, you can tell the detail difference is absolutely obscene. There's no two ways about it. It is quite something, to be honest. I think the only other time I was this impressed and surprised by the sheer level of quality of the ultrawide camera and the difference between the previous generation, well, previous half generation, because these are still in the X200 range, but regardless, the only other time I was this impressed was when the S25 Ultra launched with its brand new ultrawide camera. Which makes me think, how good is the X200 Ultra's ultrawide gonna be against the S25 Ultra, which did receive a massive upgrade this year. So suffice to say, for the most part, you are getting massive upgrades across the board on the X200 Ultra with the ultra-wide camera, which is a fantastic thing, no two ways about it, especially when you consider the fact that you have a much larger crop when you're using the main camera. So if you can use the ultra-wide camera and get much better quality out of it, that's always a good thing. But I do want to point out the fact that at least in certain backlit shots that I took with the X200 Ultra, I do think that the dynamic range preservation and the highlight roll-off was a lot more appealing on the X200 Pro as opposed to the Ultra. So that's just something to bear in mind. Now, alongside that, of course, we have the macro situation, which I think this is identical on both. I don't think there's any real difference between the two. They both have tremendous macros, some of the absolute best that you can have. Not because you can just use the telephoto camera, and not because the telephoto camera is one of the absolute best in the industry, but because you have a proper 2x sensor crop on top of a telephoto camera, alongside macro, which gives you some of the best macro shots that you could possibly hope for. But then of course, what about zoom? So we are starting off with 50mm, and bear in mind, the X200 Ultra doesn't actually need to crop in all the way to 2x specifically for 50mm. It's a much smaller crop. But regardless, cropping all the way into 500%, I would say that the difference is not a whole lot. Maybe a little bit less processing on the X200 Ultra, just a tiny amount. It's not really a difference that should bother anyone really. But what about the 3.7x telephoto? I would wager that once again we are not going to see a whole lot of difference. Now, in terms of colors, once again I do think that the overall color tones look a little bit more natural and a little bit more realistic on the X200 Ultra. But of course, cropping all the way in, and it is very obvious that the detail difference is pretty much non-existent. At least at 3.7x, you're not really going to see any major differences between the two. But then of course, what about 170mm, which is basically a 2x sensor crop? Supposedly a 2x sensor crop on the X200 Ultra. Now, the X200 Pro doesn't really go for anything as such, at least in the UI. It doesn't really tell you that you can do a 7.4x crop and it's going to give you a proper sensor crop. It doesn't really indicate anything as such. But of course, at the end of the day, if the detail preservation is the same, then, well, I don't really mind. And guess what? When we crop in all the way to 500%, the detail preservation is not the same. It's actually, I would say, just a pinch better on the X200 Pro. Now, it could be the fact that the contrast balance is much better maintained on the X200 Pro, so it looks like it has better detail preservation. It does also appear to have a little bit more sharpening action happening, at least in certain areas of the image. But despite that, it does seem like the overall details are being preserved better on the X200 Pro as opposed to the Ultra, which is quite something. But you know what? I'm gonna go ahead and say that that may just be a fluke, because this is a 10x shot right here. And once again, take a look at the colors. You see that very significant yellow tint we have on the X200 Pro is very unnatural. And the X200 Ultra is actually doing a really good job at handling the situation and giving us much more accurate color tones. Now, I know some of these have a little bit of a magenta action happening on the X200 Ultra as well, but compared to the Pro, it's definitely a lot more accurate now, as opposed to what we had before. Now, cropping all the way in, see, this is why I thought that the previous shot was a bit of a fluke, because the contrast balance is what really allowed the X200 Pro to showcase the detail preservation. Now, in this case, where the contrast balance is being maintained perfectly on both phones, you can see that the detail preservation is actually just a tiny pinch, maybe like 5% higher on the X200 Ultra. In some of the textures, it's just being brought out a little bit more, a small amount. But of course, that's not where the detail preservation stops, because we also have high resolution to tackle with. Now, the X200 Ultra obviously has the whole crop situation happening, so I honestly don't know how to take the main camera high-res shots here. I just took them as is, you know. There's nothing much I can do about it. I couldn't really move any further back without stepping into oncoming traffic for the shot either. So 35mm is just the way I had to go with, and the crop is just the way it is. There's nothing much I can do about it. And cropping into 500%, yes, the X200 Ultra does have the optical zoom advantage, weirdly enough, on the main camera. Never thought I'd say that, but well, that's just the way it is. But I do gotta say, the overall detail preservation, the sharpness, the natural sharpness we're getting in most of the details here, it's significant. Even despite the fact that we have an optical zoom advantage on the X200 Ultra, it's doing a really good job with a lot of the fine textures as opposed to the X200 Pro. Quite impressive. Now, with the ultrawide camera, things are obviously going to be obscenely interesting, right? We already know how well detail preservation can work with the X200 Ultra's ultrawide with regular photos, not even high-res. But then what happens when we go to high-res? Well, suffice to say, it's, yeah, that's... wow. That's a whole lot of detail we're getting on the X200 Ultra. This is the ultra-wide camera. Well, that's what a good sensor can get you. Now, I'm not saying that this is the absolute best in the world, because I still have to compare against the S25 Ultra. That comparison is going to come out real soon, so stay tuned for that. But I can tell you, this is one of the most impressive ultra-wide shots that I've seen, bar none, easily. It's just... it left me speechless there for a moment. I mean, that says everything, right? And then last but not least, we have the 50mm shots. Now, once again, I do gotta point this out. We have that slight bit of magenta tint happening on the X200 Ultra once again. You can very clearly see it when compared side by side, because on the X200 Pro, we have a bit of a green tint happening. And the Ultra has magenta. It's like Vivo kind of figured out that they had an issue, and then they just overcorrected a little too much into magenta. Kind of unfortunate, but again, this is something that could potentially, theoretically be fixed with a software update, so I do have some hopes here. But of course, we are here for the details, so let's crop all the way in and, well, would you look at that. This is impressive, isn't it? We have a really good amount of natural detail without overprocessing, as opposed to the X200 Pro. I mean, this is more important than you might think, because the X200 Pro, it has a very high quality 3.7x, but it also overprocesses quite a bit. The X200 Ultra, as you can probably tell, it improves upon that little thing significantly. Now, when it comes to the 200 megapixel shot of the same situation, you can see that the X200 Pro kind of just let go of all the overprocessing right there. And that's the interesting part. With 50 megapixels, the processing has improved so much on the X200 Ultra that you get a very close and similar result to the 200 megapixel mode. The only difference between the 50 and the 200 megapixel mode on the Ultra is that we have maybe a little bit more natural sharpness happening in the finer details and textures. And that's it. And now let us move on to night mode. But actually before that, I do want to address the fact that this specific camera comparison is a different format that I'm trying out, and essentially we don't have human subjects in this one. I'm doing this in an effort to be more efficient on my end and also to ensure that the videos don't get too obscenely long. But let's get back to the night mode, and the interesting thing, the one massive major upgrade on the X200 Ultra for me is that we get to use Zeiss natural colors and also textured mode if you want to use it. But once again, the same issue lies with textured mode as well. It's the fact that we don't really get to have the same level of consistency that we do from Zeiss natural colors, so I would recommend you use Zeiss natural colors on the X200 Ultra. You don't get any of those options on the X200 Pro, and it's a huge upgrade in my opinion because you get such natural color tones, as you will see soon enough. Now, another very interesting thing about the X200 Ultra is that we also get high-res night mode with Zeiss natural colors. So obviously the question is the high-res worth using at night? Well, dropping in all the way to 500%, and most definitely it is. Like this is impressive. This is definitely a significant detail upgrade for a camera that already had very good detail preservation at night. So the fact that you can use high-res just gives you such a significant leg up. I would say that I'm seeing a bit more processing than I would like on the X200 Ultra, but the detail boost is significant. It's up there. It's a lot better than what we're getting on the X200 Pro. Now, one thing that I really wanted to try out was 28mm. So I've heard that it's better to actually use 28mm with the ultrawide camera on the X200 Ultra because it's essentially a 2x sensor crop. The reason I wanted to try at night is because this is about as difficult a situation as it can be. So if the X200 Ultra's 28mm, which is a 2x sensor crop on the ultrawide camera, if it can get even close in terms of detail preservation at night, then it's actually going to be quite usable even during daytime. Hell, it could be just as good during daytime, if you want to take 28mm shots, that is. And so cropping all the way in, well, it's not bad. That's the best way to put it. Because the X200 Ultra, it does have some weird like aliasing going on around the edges, which looks really odd. And outside of that, I would say there's also more processing happening, and definitely the detail preservation is better on the X200 Pro. After all, you are using the main camera, and in general, the main camera is the most optimized camera that you have. Even if the sensors are the same, you won't get the exact same level of quality. In general, that is. And that is kind of true here, but given the fact that we took this at night, and the fact that this is a 2x sensor crop, and the fact that this is the ultra-wide camera, I would say the X200 Ultra is actually doing a very good job. So is it usable with the 28mm mode? I'd say yes. Now moving on, of course, to the ultra-wide camera, and see, this is one of the best examples of why having Zeiss natural colors on the X200 Ultra is such a game changer. So much more realistic, so much nicer of a shot, and just so much more nighttime-esque of a shot that we have on the X200 Ultra. It is night and day, the difference. Now aside of the sheer difference in the colors, there's also the fact that the detail preservation on the X200 Ultra with the ultra-wide camera is very, very high. But we can also use high resolution with night mode on the X200 Ultra. So that's what we shall be cropping in on. And well, I would suggest you guys brace yourselves because, oh man, that detail preservation on the X200 Ultra, it is just chef's kiss. No two ways about it. Just the only complaint I have is why in the goddamn hell is the X200 Ultra not available globally? Like, this is a treat to the senses, this level of detail preservation. Why can we just not buy it globally? It makes no sense. Bloody hell, it's such a good phone, such a good camera. Why can't we just enjoy it? Why do we have to go through all the hoops? It's stupid. Anyways, rant aside, I would say that the ultra-wide camera is without question one of the best aspects of the X200 Ultra. At this point, it's just made very clear to me. Now, outside of the ultra-wide camera, which is obviously fantastic, we also have our 3.7x telephoto, which on the X200 Pro, if you are going to take daylight shots, you can go for a 50 megapixel or even a 200 megapixel shot. But then on the X200 Ultra, which allows you to go for high res with night mode, you can have the 50 megapixel mode. And by the way, the colors, holy Jesus, that's some of the best nighttime colors that I've seen once again, and it doesn't even compare on the X200 Pro. It is so much more realistic on the Ultra. This is why, once again, you want those essential colors. However, cropping all the way in, well, would you look at that? It's actually not a huge difference, at least not as much as we saw in the previous shots. So that's interesting, most definitely. I guess the 50 megapixel high res doesn't really benefit as much on the X200 Ultra as opposed to regular 12 megapixels on the X200 Pro. Interesting. But then the 200 megapixel mode is actually a fair bit better as opposed to the Pro, which is kind of odd because I actually thought that we might get worse results, because usually using such high resolution at night kind of drops the quality on you. But that doesn't really seem to be the case because there's a lot more natural detail on the X200 Ultra. Now, of course, I also took some long range shots, and just once again, the colors, you know, it's a small difference in this particular case, but it just looks so much nicer, so much more perfectly balanced on the X200 Ultra. Look, I can't help it. When we have a good color profile that allows you to get natural, dark, proper nighttime shots. And finally, Vivo is allowing us to do that. This has been one of the biggest personal gripes that I've had with Vivo flagships, and well, now at least it's up there amongst the best. And I would say at 7.4x, which is basically a 2x sensor crop on top of the 3.7x telephoto, they are both performing almost exactly the same. Maybe a little bit more processing and a little bit more sharpening on the X200 Pro. Just a very minor difference, but honestly nothing much to write home about. And so with that said, we are at the end of our beautiful comparison. Now here's the deal. Here's what I've surmised. I would suggest anyone that is willing to go for the X200 Ultra to actually just use landscape mode in general with high-res enabled in most cases, if you're willing to go for that, that is. Because landscape mode, if you didn't know, is basically what is like a combination of night mode and high-res all put together. And that's what allows us to have night mode, Zeiss natural colors or any color profile of your choice, and high resolution all put together. It is just a beautiful, beautiful thing on the X200 Ultra. The X200 Pro doesn't really have something of that nature. It has a landscape mode, but it's not as fully fledged with the features, to say the least. So what I would suggest quite easily on the X200 Ultra is that you just use landscape mode in general with high resolution enabled. And if you want to take regular shots, then yeah, sure, obviously the regular photo mode is there. And if you want to take human subjects, portrait mode, all that stuff is there. But landscape mode, in my opinion, it's the MVP in the X200 Ultra, in my opinion at least. As long as you're not too worried about the storage situation, you can get some ridiculously nice shots, especially with that ultrawide camera. High-res ultrawide has never been as good. So that's, in a nutshell, the ultrawide camera has been what has impressed me more than anything else, especially in this particular comparison, because it really puts into perspective the sheer level of upgrade we have had in just half a generation. Now, honestly, I can't wait for the X300 Pro, which will hopefully, for the love of God, have all of these features packaged in a nice little bundle and transferred to the Pro version of the next generation. That's all we ask. So with that said, I do hope you guys enjoyed, found this helpful, and yes, human subjects comparison coming soon. Cheers.